Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts of the US, because we are here with Olivia Dade, who's actually in Sweden. And so being horrible with time zones, I'm assuming it's a different time there.
Yes, it's 9 o'clock at night, but that's fine. It put me past my kids' bedtime, so it was good.
Perfect. So I'm just going to do a quick housekeeping thing. We are recording this. We are live streaming on Facebook as well, so people can ask questions here or there. It's easiest for me to keep track of questions on the Q&A, so feel free to throw your questions into there. If you would like to put anything in the chat in terms of like where you're coming from, how you heard about this program, how excited you are, feel free to do so, and we'll be paying attention to that as well. And I'd like to thank the Friends of the Ashland Library for supporting all of our programming. We couldn't do this fun stuff without them. And now Olivia Dade, like I said, coming to us from Sweden. And so we appreciate your finding a time that worked for all of us to have this conversation. But I'm just going to say that Olivia Dade was a librarian. She's going to tell us more about her, but like as we get into our Q&A, you'll see why that's important. So Olivia, welcome to Ashland. Please tell us all about you.
Thank you for having me here. And I particularly love talking to libraries and doing library programs because I planned a few of them myself, some of which were better attended than others. So I'm Olivia Dade. I am an American, but I'm living in Sweden. We've been here for about 3 years. So the past couple of years, I have mostly spent in our Swedish apartment. So I can tell you all about that. And I am an author of romantic comedies, typically with at least one fat character, fat not being used as a pejorative, just as a descriptor, like you would say that I was a brunette. And my most recent 2 books published through Avon are Spoiler Alert and All the Feels. And I'm delighted to be here.
Glad you're here. I have All the Feels on my Kindle. It just doesn't translate as well, right?
That's great. I often forget for these to bring my books, and occasionally my husband will hear that. So the hand of God like comes down from behind my computer to hand me the book. He'll sidle into my office and hand it to me, but I remembered this time.
Excellent. I know. Well, maybe it would be the hand of Aeneas.
Exactly.
Okay. So I'm going to start sort of at the beginning about what brought you to writing romance. Have you always wanted to be a writer? And then why did you choose romance to be your genre?
I have been reading romance from the time I was far too young to be reading the romances I was reading. So from about 7 to 8, I think that I came from sort of a tumultuous family background, and I think it was very powerful for me to read about couples finding a happily ever after, working out their problems, and sort of reading about the prospect of relationships that were mostly healthy, because some of the old school romances, I think it's probably up for debate whether they were healthy, but sort of the idea of a guaranteed happy ending was very comforting to me from the beginning. So, I read other things too, but I always read romances primarily. However, I had no intention of ever writing romances. When I was going to college, and then I was in a doctoral program, and I had intended to be a professor, and I really enjoyed writing academic writing. And I did not think that I was any good at fiction. The few stabs I had made in school for assignments, I did not think were particularly fantastic. And so I just thought that my talents lay in nonfiction writing. Mm-hmm. And in 2014, I was a librarian at that time, and I had a child, and it had been a few years since I had sort of used my brain in the way that I used to when I was in college and graduate school. But I was still reading romances. And for whatever reason, one day I sort of sat down and I wrote a part of a scene set in the library. that was sort of a scene from a romance, and it was not great. And it was quite sad because frankly, I was also quite sad at the time. I was depressed. But it was such a relief to me to sort of be out of my own head for a few minutes. Like the process of writing and being in someone else's story rather than like my own head for that was such a relief, and I enjoyed it so much. Then I sat down and, without any sort of prospect of it meaning anything other than just me having fun with something, I wrote a full-length book set in Colonial Williamsburg, where I used to work. Set in a thinly fictionalized Colonial Williamsburg, Colonial Marysburg. No one would ever know, Mina.
We'll read whatever you write. Doesn't matter what you say.
The code was just too strong to break, too complicated. And it was not good. It was lacking what is, as I've often said, what is conventionally termed a plot, which, as it turns out, was a necessary component of books, many books at least. But that was sort of where it started. And then my second book I ever wrote got published, and you can kind of tell it was the second book that I ever wrote, which is part of the reason I haven't. It's from my Love Shark Librarian series, and it's part of the reason I have not reissued them yet, because some of them are a little rougher than others.
Well, I remember discovering them because I'm librarian, I was always intrigued by finding books that had librarians as the hero or heroine. And I thought they were really clever. I won't go into it because people should read them. And I know that that's a tease because you can't get them right now. But I'm kind of curious about like why you thought, librarians could be, a main character in a romance, a smexy romance.
I am a big believer in writing what you know. I'm happy. I've branched out more from that in recent years. But
okay, wait.
Yes.
I'm going to ask about the stuffed animals and the thing. So like when you say you're writing what you know.
Not all. I know, but the setting, I really had to work on getting better at descriptions and settings, because when I write, if I'm not careful, they could just be bantering in a formless void. Like I need to actually have a setting in mind. And so basically the place I knew best was my rural library in, rural Maryland. And the architecture of that library is precisely the same as that library where I worked. The reason, as I told you a few minutes ago, the reason that they end up having sex on a pile of stuffed animals covered by a tablecloth is because I looked around the library and literally the only soft things they could use as a mattress if they were snowed in overnight were the stuffed animals. But as we also discussed, every soft surface in the library you should just assume is filthy and diseased. And so that's why they had a nice clean tablecloth for the stuffed animals to protect the kiddos, but also to make sure that their butts didn't fall off from some terrible flesh-eating disease from those stuffed animals.
I'm going to also stop you and say, disclaimer, libraries are very clean nowadays. Unless you want to have sex with them, in which case you get what you get.
Exactly. So yes, I think I just was very deeply entertained by the thought of them having sex in the library, even though it's not something I did, and it's not something I ever saw, although I did hear stories, not about my coworkers, but in the stacks. As you know, patrons will do a number of things, that you don't expect people to do in libraries, and
or in public. Yeah.
Or in public, and that is one of them occasionally. Yes,
that's right. But just sort of on the serious note, do you find that writing about librarians who generally don't get written about in romances, but although they're more often now, was were we underrepresented? not to take away from really underrepresented people, but
I think that sometimes there is a wing, and it's a very tempting wing of romance, and it's for good reason very popular, which is sort of more fantasy based, the sort of jobs that you would have if you were sort of fantasizing about the most glamorous possible jobs that you might have, and about wealth and things like that. And those are very powerful fantasies for people, and for good reason. And so librarians, as glamorous as we are, maybe that's not going to be the first thing that, if you're looking or writing that sort of story, that may not be the first thing you would reach for. I mean, I know there were stories with librarians in them, but for me, even when I'm writing with movie stars or television stars, as I did with Spoiler Alert and All the Feels, I try to keep it pretty grounded, like, you know, in the realities of, I try to keep it pretty grounded in reality. Like, I'm not sure glamour is really my calling card in my books, even the books where that could be sort of a temptation. So, but yes, as I see in the comments, librarian is a fantasy career for some folks, and there was a lot that I loved about it when I did it. But I think that if you're sort of on the glamour end of what you're looking for, then, you know, it's not maybe what you would steer toward.
Yeah, but I think that you're right, that there was a definite phase of the billionaire, millionaires, and it continues. But there was also like this huge phase for like the small town romances, you know, another sheriff, but still like the engineers, the, you know, just the regular day-to-day people. And I think that that makes, in some ways, it's a fantasy because of the experience in the book, not necessarily the money part of it or the glamour part of it. So I think that that's really great. So I'm gonna, what made you transition to like these fuller length novels?
Well, I had a 6-book series that I did with the Librarians. And that was a brief moment in time where the publishers, traditional publishers, were sort of looking at self-published authors and the sort of money that they were making, and then seeing whether they could sort of figure out a way to get part of that. And so they had what they called digital first or e-first publications, which is what my Librarian series was, where it was not going to be in bookstores typically. It was going to be print on demand if you wanted a paperback. If it was a novella, it wasn't going to be in print at all. And so basically it was digital, no advances. It was not, they were acquiring a lot of content, and I'm not sure always giving the sort of support that you might have always wished, because they were acquiring a lot of content and seeing whether it would stick with people. And there were people who did really well with that. You know, Tessa Bailey came out of some of that. You know, she was with Entangled for a long time. There are other people, Lucy Parker, who emerged from that model, but there are a lot of us who floundered. And I mean, I will say that I was one of them. My books did not do particularly well. And so I took a break of about a couple of years where I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, because I did not want to do what I've been doing anymore. And as far as that sort of form of publishing. So then I had to sort of make the decision, did I want to self-publish entirely, or did I want to give traditional publishing another chance? If it wanted to give me another chance, which was really a big question, because my sales numbers, frankly, were not great. So the question is whether they would want to pick me up and put me in bookstores. And so I wrote for those 2 years, but then after 2 years, I decided I wanted to sort of give it one last shot, and I got a different agent. I'd parted ways with my old one. I got a different agent, and I told her, who's wonderful, and I told her, print or bust. Like, look at these stories I've written. Which of these do you think are things that we could shop to a traditional publisher and they might want to have it in print in bookstores? And if you don't think that's something they would want, then I'll just self-publish it. And so that's sort of the agreement we came to. So some of those stories I did self-publish. And then the story we actually shopped was 40 Love, which ended up being self-published because publishers didn't want it. But I had given as a follow-up right before we were about to send this off to publishers, my agent said, you need to have proposals for 2 follow-up books, which was unfortunate because I had no idea what to do for follow-up books. So I had these random ideas about a Game of Thrones-esque TV show and people who sort of hated the ending of their own show, actors, and then the idea of an actor writing fanfic for his own show. And I was like, how can I connect this to 40 Love? If you've read 40 Love, the main character Tess has a best friend named Belle who goes on vacation with her. Belle's original name in the story was April because April was her best friend in the book. And then April was meant to be the next follow-up with spoiler alert to 40 Love. But it was so tangentially related. It was completely different universes, which publishers realized, and they also realized, which I did not realize, that spoiler alert was much more marketable, frankly, than 40 Love. So they're like, so change the name of her best friend. We're not going to publish that, but we will take these 2 follow-up books that you proposed. So that is how, and my agent, bless her heart, like she went after it for me. And Avon was kind enough to pick me up and really support me. Elle Keck, who just left publishing this last month, which is deeply painful and a real loss for the industry, although I understand why. They're deeply underpaid and overworked. But she picked me up and really supported me. I've had a great experience at Avon. So I don't know if that was what you were asking, but that's what I told you.
Yes. It's nice to get the whole picture. But I think that spoiler alert just jumped into the world and people just loved it from the beginning. I certainly did. And it's got sort of everything, you know. I laughed, I cried, you know, all of that stuff. But what what do you think resonated with so many people for this book after you'd written so, you know, all this and had self-published and everything? What was it about this book?
This book is more high concept in that it was the whole idea of the fan fiction element, which is a lot of folks, including myself, love fan fiction. The fact that Game of Thrones was ending, and this was sort of a little bit of a play on sort of a Game of Thrones-esque show. It is very different to have your book available in bookstores, and it's very different to have a traditional publisher sort of give some might to your, you know, marketing and publicity for your books. And I think that's part of it, but it's also just a bigger story. I mean, frankly, when I started writing, spoiler alert, I had no idea how it was going to do. So I sort of said to myself, this may be the biggest audience you ever have for one of your books. So whatever you really want to say, like, you need to say it here, because there's no guarantee that you'll ever have this big an audience again. So like, if there's something that you really want to have on page, like, do it. So I sort of swung for the fences with spoiler alert. And it means that there's a lot going on in the book, but there were things that I wanted to have on page specifically about not all my books may have bad characters. Not all my books really talk about fatness that much. A lot of times it's relatively incidental that they're fat, but there were things I wanted to say about fat shaming within communities and within families and people who care about you but still hurt you. And I wanted to have on page boundary setting with people that you care about who are, you know, who are hurting you. And I because a lot of romances that I had read growing up, the very few ones that did have fat characters, they often had family members or loved ones who were fat shaming them through the whole book. And there was never any consequences. There was never sort of a point where the person who is being hurt said no more. And it seemed like the message that you were sort of getting was that if someone loves you, you just have to put up with it. Like, it's so they don't mean to hurt you, they don't realize, so you just sort of say, okay, I just have to love myself and accept that they're going to hurt me. And I don't believe that. So that's fine. If for some people that's the message they want. For me, I wanted to see on the page someone saying that I love you, I want you in my life, but if you're going to be in my life, then you need to stop hurting me. So there are things that just, again, I was like, I went for it because who knew if I would ever have the opportunity again.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's really interesting. And I find it's interesting that too, in this chat, Sarah says that she was specifically looking for larger heroines, and that Tiffany is mentally dating Alec in her book world. It's awesome. But I really like that you wrote about so many different things in Spoiler Alert, because it wasn't just about the fat shaming. It was that everybody deserves a happily ever after. Whether you're fat or you've got dyslexia, or like you're neurodivergent in any way. That sort of really brought it to the fore that people really just deserve to be happy.
Right. I mean, that one of the big things that's important to me in my books is the idea that you don't have to be perfect to be loved. There is not one type of body that you need to be loved. There is not one type of don't need to be neurotypical. You don't need to be successful to be loved. You don't have to be, you can have mental illness and be loved. And that's something I sort of want to talk about more in a future book, but one of my self-published books, she has anxiety. And that is sort of one of the things I want to accomplish in my career. Is sort of to have a variety of different types of characters who are not perfect, but who are loved not despite being imperfect, but loved in part because that's what makes them special,
Right. And I also like that you say that as you said, that there was this sense that people weren't telling them, like, I deserve to be loved, like, you don't hurt me, because of fat shaming and all of this. But there was never that confrontation, that sense of confidence that you can take somebody on and say, I love you. Love doesn't mean that you can say whatever you want to me. And I really like that about your books, because I think that there is so much power in that, like actually standing up for yourself.
I've joked before that, do you go on the Archive of Our Own, like fanfic?
No, I don't.
When they list pairings, if it's pairings, sometimes it's thruples or whatever, but if they list pairings, it's like, in my case, it would be Jamie Lannister / Brienne of Tarth. And I've joked before that my pairing in my books would be Olivia Dade / Boundaries.
Your true love.
I mean, also, I'm not sure, you probably have a wide audience, so also dirty jokes. I was going to use another term, but I won't.
You can. I'm all over.
So it would also be Olivia Dade / dick jokes, but it's also Olivia Dade / Boundaries. So one true pairing.
Well, I actually think, like, to me, it's, again, your sense of humor in your books is what brings me back every time. I just laugh hysterically. I mean, like, I'm thinking about the harpies, and the t-shirts. There's just, I don't want to give any spoilers, but is it you? Like, do you think you're, like, really funny? Do you have to work for it? I mean, do you read other things and, like, ooh, that would be funny? How does that fit?
I think every author, when they start writing, there are certain things that are going to come naturally to them in their voice, and there are other things that are going to require work. So in my case, I was not great at descriptions, and I really had to work on that. I was not great at settings, as I'm not sure whether we were filming or not at that time, but, like, if it were up to me and I were not thinking about it, people would be basically introspecting and bantering or having sex in a formless void. Like, there would be nothing around them. So these are things.
Sounds like a magical world.
I know. So these are things that I've had to work on, and also the emotional component. My early Love Struck Librarian books are much more farcical and less sort of, I think, emotionally sort of packed than my more recent books. And part of that's just my comfort in being able to be openly emotional without trying to sort of distance myself from it with a joke, you know, and that took me time because frankly, there was a period where I wasn't sure anyone would want to read my writing if it wasn't funny. And so it took me some time to have the confidence in my writing to say that I could have a chapter or 2 or 3 chapters in a row where there wasn't much funny happening, but people would still want to read it. So that's something I had to work on. But from the beginning, I always was, you know, the humor came relatively naturally to me. My husband thinks I'm funny. My daughter thinks I'm funny. I can't promise that anyone else does, but the books, to me, in the books, that came pretty naturally to me. Banter, humor, sex scenes. I really enjoyed writing sex scenes from the beginning. There are authors who hate it, and there are authors who it feels like free words. I'm more, if I'm in the right mood, it's more like free words.
Oh, yeah. I think that's great. I also think it's really interesting because oftentimes the person who's slightly different, somebody who's overweight or somebody who is neurodivergent or something, ends up being the class clown. And so that is sort of a trope, I think, that was used a lot to have characters that had those things, that, you know, those issues in books. And I think that you've created this like really rich person that is funny. You know what I mean?
I mean, my goal always is that fatness is not the point of that, that the character is fat, but that is not by far the most interesting thing about them. That they have a full life, as I do, as all fat people do, that involves work, and it involves family, and it involves community and friendships, and to make sure that they are fully realized human beings that are given sort of the opportunity to be fully realized human beings, that doesn't depend past a certain size. It's not like your life becomes all about your weight or about food.
Right.
And so it's important to me, and I think it came naturally to me because I kind of, like, it would never even occur to me to make a fat character their life and their identity all about fatness, because how could I do that and sort of stay true to represent who I am? And the my fat friends and fat family, it would be a disservice to them.
Right, and that there's never any indication in your books that somebody has to lose weight in order to be loved or to act normal to be, you know, to have people care for them. So that is another aspect of your books that I think is very powerful.
It is very, you know, all marriages have their high spots and low spots, but I will say that one of the things I truly, truly love about my marriage and my husband is that all the things that I thought were going to be detractions that would make it hard for someone to love me, are all things he in some ways especially loves about me. They're either just not a problem for him, or they're things that he particularly loves about me, things that I thought were flaws. And that's sort of radical acceptance and love is something that I want it to be unconditional, you know, not that you can harm that person, but that your love, it's not that you would forgive anything they did to you, but that you unconditionally love them as they are is very important to me. Not as you would wish them to be, not if they were different, you would love them more, but you love them as they are, because it's transformative to be loved in a way that you feel completely accepted for who you are.
I think I might cry. Hold on a second. Nope, I'm good. That was really beautiful. I was going to say that I think that I forgot because it was so beautiful. Anyways, I'm going to go to some of our attendee questions, and then I'll get back to mine too. Can Caitlin asks, your books roam across the nation and we travel with the characters to boot. How do locations inform your writing, and are they always places you visited?
So my first books were all set where I lived because I am naturally a little bit anxious, and I was trying to make things as easy on myself as possible. So just setting them where basically in a fake town that was basically where I lived was easiest for me. But at a certain point, some of the stories I wanted to tell could not be in a rural Maryland or Virginia town, or in basically a very thinly veiled analog of Williamsburg, Virginia. So for instance, when I wrote Spoiler Alert, that was actually my first book that was very definitively set somewhere where I had not been. At the time I wrote it, I had not been to San Francisco. I have now been several times since then and loved it. But I did that because I was living in Sweden by then, and I think a part of me sort of longed to visit parts of the US. I had a lot of friends in San Francisco, and frankly, it's San Francisco because my friend, who is a geologist, Margreta Martin, I basically picked her brain and like stole her job for April. So April has Margreta's jobs, and Margreta lives near San Francisco. So I was like, guess what? I'm just borrowing lunch. She was fine with it. It's fine. But like, I set it in San Francisco because if you're going to talk about what sort of geology work she's going to be doing, that's going to depend on what industries were in the area. So what sort of contaminants you have in the ground. It would be different if she were in West Virginia. So like, it made sense to set it near LA and to set it where she was. So, and then with Alex and Lauren with all the feels, then, LA became, and then the reason there's a road trip is because it was the pandemic and I couldn't go back to the US and I was stuck in my apartment and I desperately wanted to take a trip on the California coast. And so that was basically my longing to be traveling and to be on the road and to be near the water and sunshine and yeah.
Well, I love the road trip aspect of that story. I felt like it really moved the story forward in so many ways. And I remember now what I was going to ask you earlier is, or maybe comment on, was that I find it really interesting that people see themselves through a certain lens, and that doesn't really change until somebody says to them, but that's not all that you are. That's not how I see you. And so like when you were talking about, what you thought your flaws was, and your husband was like, I love that about you. We often miss that, I think, when we're only kind of in our own heads.
I think that often the most lovable parts of ourselves are the parts that are not the most mainstream parts of ourselves. I mean, I think the things that make you different are often the things that will make you beloved to someone else, because they're interested in you and that they, that makes you unique to them. So, at least that's been my experience. So, and I'm fortunate and I know that, but yep, I genuinely believe, and also I believe very much in being yourself in a relationship, because I can't imagine not the stress of trying to be someone other than who you are, like in a day-to-day life with someone else.
Yeah, and I think that we're always looking to see ourselves in our fiction or our reading, and your books really bring that to life. Like Sarah was just saying in the chat a little while ago, she was looking for larger heroines. I don't know if you're large, have that, Sarah, but I just think that like we all look for ourselves in the books that we read, and this is like a great age for that, I think.
Something I've said before, but I truly believe is that, I grew up sort of looking for myself on the page, and it wasn't there often. And, fat main characters were rarely there. And when they were, often they were trying to lose weight, or people were being horrible to them. And it was often the point of the entire book. Like that had to be the point of the entire book. And it was important to me, like for anyone to see themselves on the page. BIPOC readers, LGBTQIA readers, neurodivergent readers, and so forth. Because I firmly believe that seeing yourself loved on the page makes it easier for you to love yourself. Like that, it sort of lets you think, no, there could be someone out there who could love me, that I am lovable. And if you never see that on the page, it's easy to sort of think, well, there must be something wrong with me.
Mhm.
Like if you have nothing but a sea of like white, cishet, thin, beautiful people, Christian, neurotypical people, those are the people who get love and a happy ending. And only those people get love and a happy ending. It's very sort of, it's just much easier to love yourself and imagine yourself being loved if you can see it on the page.
I completely agree, because I'm Indian and I rarely saw myself in romance until like the last few years. And now I'm like, oh, Indians do have sex. Indians do. They do get their happily ever after. They don't always have arranged marriages. It's just really, it's wonderful to see the diversity in books. I think that we have a long way to go, but it's nice that it's moving in the right direction.
Right.
Sarah says, I don't know your life story. Were you a full-time author when you moved to Sweden?
I was. I was working in the library, and then I left the library to write full-time. And so by the time part of the reason we were actually able to move here was because I could write from anywhere. So yes, I was full-time before I came. And so I was already spending all my time in my Swedish apartment. So it was probably less of a change for me than for many people during the pandemic, because I was already in here all the time. So yes.
You moved to Sweden during the pandemic?
No, we moved in 2018, like August 2018. So we were here for about a year and a half, but I was already used to being in the apartment all the time at my computer. And because I worked from home, writing, and I always write in my office. And then the pandemic came and I was like, well, guess I'll be here for some time to come. And
not a bad place to be, right?
Yes.
Just a follow-up for that, Sarah says, do you want to tell us anything about your transition to living abroad?
I think that I moved some when I was in my 20s. I went away to college, and then I went away to Wisconsin for graduate school. I'm from the Maryland, Virginia area. And I traveled by myself, and I think that I had assumed that I was more flexible than I turned out to be, but part of that may have been I was in my 40s when I moved. And I think that Sweden has been wonderful in many ways. And there are things that I really love about the culture here and about the political system and the economic system. But I'm someone who based a lot of sort of my sense of self on being able to, my use of words, being able to maneuver around systems, competence. And it's hard then, if words are sort of your trade, to move somewhere where you don't know the language, and words are no longer something you're competent at least in that realm. And that if you're someone who sort of prided themselves on knowing how to do things and get things accomplished, that you don't know how things work. And these are all things that can be learned, but it is sort of destabilizing to your sense of self. And I think that has been harder on me than I anticipated. But I also didn't anticipate most of my time in Sweden has now been spent during a pandemic. Like a majority of my time, a pretty large majority of my time. So I think that changes things too. So it's been a hard transition. It was especially hard since I hadn't been in the US. There was a long gap before I got back to the US, because until I got double vaccinated. And during that time, my mom had cancer. She's fine now, but like it's been tough. I mean, I'm just being, I guess I could have been cheerier about it, but I want to be honest. There's a lot I love about it, but it's been a hard transition for me.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when I got married, I moved from DC to Boston, and I was like, what's going on here? Same language, but different, totally different culture.
Yeah.
So Caitlin asks, what fat representation or stories have been important to you?
I would say that I kept some of those early romances I read that had it was female main characters. It's only very recently that you start seeing fat male main characters. Frankly, I think as a community, we're much more loath to accept fat male main characters than we are female main characters. By the way, my next book in the series, Shipwrecks, both of the main characters are fat, which was
Awesome.
important to me. So I kept those books. Would I recommend them for fat representation? No. But it was a way for me to see myself on the page, even if it was painful. And so I kept them because it was meaningful to me. Most of the good fat representation I've seen has been quite recent. Like Talia Hibbert has great fat representation. We have, of course, my brain goes blank when I do this. Recently, Weather Girl by Rachel Lynn Solomon had a fat male main character. I thought that was really nicely done. There is Marie Lipscomb, who is a self-published author who writes fat female and male main characters, and she does a great job with that. And Rebecca Weatherspoon often has fat main characters. Another self-published author is Katrina Jackson. So those are all sort of recent ones that I have found not painful. And of course, Julie Murphy, who's like in recent years, sort of the godmother of YA, but now is moving into adult. And in fact, just yesterday, I read her upcoming book with Sierra Simone, called Have a Merry Little Meet Cute. Or Merry Little Meet Cute. And it is wonderful. And as a fat female main character who is an adult film star and gets cast under a different name for like a Hallmark type Christmas movie. They don't know that she's also an adult film star, like a feminist adult film star, happily doing it. It's very sex positive and sex worker positive, which I very much appreciate, as well as being fat positive. And that he's sort of a former boy band member who's trying to clean up his image, and he's starring opposite her on the set. And it's Julie Murphy and Sierra Simone, who wrote Priest, if you've read that. And it is, first of all, hilarious, like really entertaining from start to end, but also just so refreshingly, again, sex positive and sex worker positive and fat positive, and just, it's great. So, I mean, I don't know when that comes out, probably closer to Christmas because it is sort of Christmassy set. But it is both, it's not a contradiction in terms to say that it's sweetly raunchy. Like it is raunchy, but it is actually very sincerely sort of and sweetly so. I really enjoyed it. So yeah, Julie Murphy obviously is another great one.
I just added that to my net galley list, or I'm going to, because I can't wait till December. So I was going to ask you, what has been your most favorite poignant thing to write in your books? What made you cry in your own book?
The way I know that an emotional scene is working, and this is not true for every author. Like, I have a dear friend who is like ice cold. she writes amazing emotional scenes, right? Where you're like sobbing. And she's like, I told her once, I'm like, when I write something sad, I cry because I'm sort of in the character's head and point of view, and I'm crying too. And that's how I know that I've actually hit sort of an emotional core to the scene for me. And I told her that, and she was like, nah. No. So like, that is not true for every author. But for me, if I'm crying, then I know that that for me, it's an effective emotional scene. I mean, I think each book sort of has some of those. I mean, for me, the most emotional scene in, spoiler alert, is April's discussion with her mother. For me, that discussion with her mother at the end of the book, the sort of boundary setting scene is it for the non-romance story. I mean, the romance is obviously the crux of the book, but the parts that are not necessarily about the romance, that was important to me. As I said, it's one of the main reasons I wrote the book, was to write that scene. And yeah, I was sobbing as I wrote it. In all the feels, I mean, there are several scenes, but I think Alex, sort of the aftermath of the breakup, and the scene where sort of Ren realizes exactly what she's been doing to herself, like that she just assumed that she was not as important as the people around her, and that she would not be worth his career. And then she sort of realizes, but that she just assumed that. That doesn't mean that he believes that too. And like, so I cried during that too. So I cry a lot, but that's usually how I know that that a scene is working for me. I mean, not like funny scenes or sex scenes. I'm not like sobbing as I write sex scenes. But a scene that is meant to be sad.
Like you have to get the fan out for those ones. But so I have to say that I was really unhappy with the breakup, because I was like, everything you've written up to that point, they communicated. And I was just like, how could she make this assumption, as you said? And then you just like, you brought it around, and I was like, oh, you're a genius. Because it had to happen.
They did. They both needed to get their shit together like, before they could have for what for me would be a believable happy ending. My goal is always, I would say, in my self-published books, I go a lot softer on like the breakup stuff. Like 40 Love, they don't ever really break up. I'm kind of low angst in general. And I will tell you that generally I talk to my editor, like, here's my ideas for what's going to happen in the book. And to this point, my editor, who's, again, I have a new one now, but my previous editor was just like, hurt them more, Olivia. Like, make them suffer. Because like the original, my original idea for the scene of the breakup scene of Marcus and April, when he says, can you forgive me? She said, I don't know. And my editor was like, nope. So I was like, fine. No, I can't forgive you. It's just like, make them hurt. So,
well, you did.
I know. But my goal is always that if you're going to have like a breakup or a scene like that, right? It has to be something that when you look back, you realize that it was telegraphed almost from the beginning. Like, that this was inevitable. At some point, this was going to happen. Like with Alex and Lauren, the way he reacts throughout to any insult to her, it's going to keep happening. I mean, on internet culture, people are going to be, even if you're beautiful, people are cruel sometimes. And if you're someone who is not conventionally beautiful, who is fat and short and not conventionally beautiful, people are going to be ugly to you sometimes. That's just the way it's going to be. And if he's going to lose his mind on those people, it's not sustainable. Like, how can she doesn't want that for him, she doesn't want that from him, but he needs to sort of, it has to be something where my hope is when you look back, you're like, no, this needs to happen because there are things they need to sort of work out for themselves so that they can come back together and actually have a believable happy ending, and also probably get some therapy.
Get some help. I especially felt that about Lauren. Like, I used to be a social worker before I became a librarian. I was like, get some help there. You don't have to get to that. You don't have to get to that point in order to you don't have to get to a breaking point, I guess. Melanie says, since you live in Sweden now, might that become a setting for a future story? Maybe once you can explore it freely.
It may. I know that they're actually, the next story, Shipwrecks, Maria is actually Swedish. And there are a couple scenes set where they go on the part of their press junket at the end of filming, which with her and Peter, they go actually to Stockholm and they visit her family there. So I got to put in a few little Swedish odds and ends there, make my ABBA jokes and my herring jokes. And my IKEA jokes, because I just love doing that. You know, I had Lucas in 40 Love is also Swedish, so like I got in some meatball jokes there. But this one, actually, they are in Sweden for a little bit, but maybe at some point, yeah, I will make one where probably like me, an American coming to Sweden, because to me, you know, that's the story of sort of dislocation and what it means. I actually considered once, because, you know, when I wasn't leaving my apartment, I was like, who would you actually meet if you were not already married and had kids? Like, who would you actually meet in this circumstance? And they were installing solar panels, but also during the winter, a lot of the buildings in Stockholm and other areas, they have teams of people who come and like get the snow off the roof safely. They like make sure there's no one around, because otherwise you have these snow avalanches from the roofs and it can hurt people. And I was like, and I have a skylight in my office. And I thought to myself, like, that would be who you would meet, is one of the dudes up on the roof, like shoveling the snow off your roof, you know, but you would like poke his head in the skylight and be like, hey, either that or I guess a burglar. But, but the dude with the snow removal on the roof seemed like it would be sexier than a burglar. Unless you were like a sexy cat burglar. But like, I'm not sure that our apartment looks like there's like a ton of jewels, like a sexy cat burglar.
I know. Well, Amanda just said what I exactly was thinking, is I would pre-order that Skylight Shoveler romance ASAP.
I'm sorry that I made you feel awkward about your dad, Melanie. Those two don't go together. I'm sure your dad is very much the model of a romantic hero, but not for you. Yes.
So Melanie also asks, any hints on what you're working on now post spoiler alert series? So you've already talked about Shipwreck a little bit, unless you want to talk about that a bit more, and then what's coming after that?
So do you want to know I can tell you the premise of Shipwrecks. I don't know if anyone already knows what the premise of it is.
Go for it.
Okay. So the characters Maria and Peter. It is the second book in a series that became All the Fields, was actually meant to be Maria and Peter's story, but Alex kind of stole the show, and spoiler alert. So then he kind of took over. He just elbowed his way into the second book. So Maria and Peter she comes to LA for sort of the final auditions for the role in this Gods of the Gates television show. And she figures one way or another, she's never coming back to LA anytime soon, because if she doesn't get the role, she'll be back in Sweden. If she does get the role, she's going to this Irish island where for like years at a time, they will be filming this desolate Irish island off the West Coast. So she meets a dude named Peter, and they have a really hot one-night stand, and she's not like a super sentimental sort. So she's like, I'm never going to see this guy again. So she leaves in the middle of the night before he wakes up, and doesn't leave any contact information, because she's like, I'm never going to see this guy again, as hot as he is. And then she goes in for these final chemistry auditions. They're down to like the final 2 or 3 people for each part. And of course, the other person on this deserted Irish island who's cast to be opposite her is, of course, Peter, the dude that she just hit it and quit it with the night before, who's not happy that she hit it and quit it without any last words or contact information. And so he's kind of surly. And then they're going to be on an island together for 6 years. So my alternate name for the book was Only One Island. Because forced proximity is my jam. Like, that's my #1 catnip. I love seeing the main characters on the page together as much as humanly possible. So in my reading and in my writing. So, and then what I'm going to write next, I'm sort of going between, by the way, I really love the book. Like, I really love the book. So I hope readers do too. And I wrap up kind of the whole series in the epilogue. So if you're wondering like whether Ron and RJ, the showrunners, will get their comeuppance, And if
I
you're
am.
wondering sort of how things are going to play out, then you will make sure, I would read the epilogue in the book.
I'm gonna pre-order that too right now.
I think it's up for pre-order, and I think in the next week I'm going to be choose violence. In the next week, I will. I think I'll be able to share the cover, which is amazing. I'm so excited because Lenny Kaufman is my cover artist. Just killed it, and I told her I wanted a relatively hot cover, like that. I wanted it like because I like to see a little heat on the illustrated covers. I was like, I love my covers for like all the feels. I love that cover. But I was like, no, I want a little, like, because they have a lot of chemistry. Like they start out with like sleeping together on first time they meet. Like there needs to be some heat in the cover. So we'll see. Anyway.
That's good though, because I think that, there's so many of the skinny, characters or whatever that are, like Fabio in the, Joanna Lindsay covers. And it would be nice to see some skin on these characters that we're really going to fall in love with.
It's not like they don't see a ton of skin, but like there's
heat.
It's good. Like that's all I will say. I think it's great.
All right, well,
and then past that, I have a couple of ideas, but I'm contracted for 2 more books in Avon in a new series. I've run them past my agent and she just wants me to write them up and give them to Avon. So I don't know which one that they will want me to do. So I probably shouldn't talk about those too much yet. I'm sorry. Once I know which one I'm writing, I will happily share it, but I don't know which one yet. But I will say one of them was inspired by my my ill-fated, traumatizing watching of the movie Atonement, which I watched completely so I could watch James McAvoy's Sex a Woman in the Library, like against the ladder. And I totally should have stopped there. And the rest of it like traumatized the hell out of me. And like, so part of it is inspired from that experience. And then part of it is I've had in my notes, and apparently there was another book that kind of tangentially was about this that came out this year, but I've had in my story ideas for years now. If you've ever, you're from the Boston Spite House.
Oh,
I want to have a book that involves, I've wanted to do a book that involves a spite house. If you don't know what that is, like in Boston, there is a spite house. It's this tiny, narrow little 10-foot wide house built between 2 others out of spite because they didn't want the people, I think, to be able to build like across and join the properties. So it was built specifically to spite them.
Like the malt house in Harry Potter, that little.
So my concept for that involves a spite house. So I can tell you that much, but I'm excited about, that's probably the one I'm guessing I'm going to do next, but we'll see.
Well, we're here for you. Caitlin asks, do your family members get to see some of or all of your writing as you write?
As I write, no. There are very few people if I let other people's voices in while I write, it can sort of just make me question myself too much. I could get too much in my head and it would be hard for me to keep going. The one exception to that would be if I need my editor to look at something, but more recently, Emma Berry, who's a dear friend of mine and has read all my books since like 2017, like the last 5 years. Shipwrecked, I wrote the first 30,000 words and I was like, something is not working here. So I sent it to her. And she's like, she's so sweet and she'll say it very nicely, but she's an English professor too. And so like, she's like, Olivia, some things aren't working here. And then we talked it through and I was like, oh, I get it. And then I went back and revamped the first third and then it was smooth sailing from there, but it is rare. It's usually I have a good sense before I start of where I'm going. But that one gave me some trouble. Mm-hmm. I can even tell you that the reason, and this is not a spoiler, it starts out on this, is because they have the one night stand. So my original version of the story had a sex scene in the first chapter. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't that it was hard to write the sex scene, but it wasn't working for me. And the reason I finally realized it was not working for me was because there was no emotional stakes in the sex scene, because you don't know them yet. And so for me, it was like, yeah, it's hot, but like it didn't interest me because I don't know them yet. Like, so I realized that I could not do it that way. I had to work it out a different way, because as much as I wanted to, like, because All the Fields was a slow burn, and I wanted to do sort of the opposite of a slow burn. And as much as I kind of thought it'd be fun to have a sex scene in the first chapter, I was like, this just isn't working for me. And once I started playing around with that, then it got better.
Michelle says, how did you end up with a Swedish man?
He was working at a Volvo facility in Maryland, and he was only supposed to be in the US for like 2-3 years. He was a consultant. And then he got snagged by an American hussy. We met online. We met through internet dating, and we should never have been matched, because he, in theory, only wants someone who's within 100 miles of him. And I was in Williamsburg, Virginia, so I was 240 miles away. My guess is that he just chose the wrong button. He's really terrible about online forums. But we should have been matched, but we were. And we had our first date 16 years ago yesterday.
Oh, that's amazing. I think sometimes, things happen for a reason, right?
Yeah.
Gabriella asked this question a while ago, and I like to ask this sort of at the end, but what authors and books have inspired your writing?
As far as, thank you, Caitlin. As far as my humor, I would say, I was chatting with Mina before this started, that Jennifer Cruzy, particularly actually her, not even necessarily Bet Me, which is her best known, I would say, of her books, or probably the most beloved of her books, but she has a book, Getting Rid of Bradley, that is hilarious. It's quite farcical, I would say. And I think you can especially see her influence on my Librarian series. Like, I think that you can sort of see me being influenced by that a little bit more. And then I sort of, as I kept writing, I think I became more invested and sort of just grounded in my own humor. But I think you can see that in there. As far as I'm inspired by Joanna Bourne. She writes historical romance. She is one of the best full-on writers I think our genre has had. I'm not sure she's writing anymore. But she's so good at deep point of view. And by that, I mean, when you're in a character's point of view in her books, if they walk into a bar, what they would notice first is what someone of their background and their experience and their profession and their nationality, it's what they would notice first. What they would think, the metaphors they would use, are all deeply grounded in that specific character. There is nothing generic in their language. There's nothing generic in their observations. It is all very specific to the character. It is so thoughtful, and it is inspiring to me. Can I write like that? No. And I don't. I mean, she writes Napoleonic spies. Like, it's not what I do, right? This is not but it is deeply inspiring to me. Like, when I wrote Teach Me, one of my self-published books, my goal, I had just reread all her books. My goal was to do a better job with deep point of view. And I think I, hopefully have been better since then. Mia Sosa, who's a dear friend of mine, what inspires me about her is that she is so good at high concept, like coming up with these really, like, oh, that sounds so fun. Like, you hear it, you're like, that sounds amazing. And also when she writes with she's able to write with thinking about how things would look on screen. Like, if it were a movie, how would this be? Like, she's very good at plot. She's very good at sort of thinking of set pieces, if that makes sense, in a way that I am not. Like, I joked with friends that, I mean, I edited it, it's better, but like, there were a couple chapters in my book where I said that this book should be called Introspection, the novel. and she is so good about like making sure like stuff happens and like it's funny, it's witty, and it's very modern, all of it. And she also writes communities and families so beautifully. So, I mean, she's an inspiration to me always.
I loved her, was it The Next Best Man or
The Worst Best
The Worst
Man.
Best Man? Yeah, I love that book.
And I just read the one that's coming out next month, The Wedding Crasher, which was wonderful. Part of what I really loved about it, it's funny and it's sexy, but they communicate really well. Like the problems they have, the things they're overcoming is not because they're not communicating well. There's no big secrets they're keeping from each other. And I like that. That's one of my things I really love is characters who are actually communicating with one another well.
Yeah, that big misunderstanding thing is old. Like, I'd like that too. So just one last quick question. What are you reading right now?
I told you a bunch of them. Let me see.
Oh, that's true.
I have the Merry Little Me, I have a Merry Little Me Cute, the Merry Little, anyway, the one with Julie Murphy and Sierra Simone, which is great. The Wedding Crasher, again, I just read, which was fantastic. I also read Chloe Liez's book that's coming out that's sort of loosely based on Much Ado About Nothing, Two Wrongs Make a Right. And that is fantastic. Another book with really good communication throughout a lot of it, and it has neurodiverse characters, and she's a fantastic writer, and that's her, I think, debut with Berkeley, maybe. I think it's her trad pub debut, if I'm not mistaken, and she did great. And the other book that I've read in recent months that I'm recommending to everyone is Mimi Matthews. I don't know if you've read her book. She has been very successfully self-published, writing Victorian historical romances, like very well researched, like beautifully written. But this was her first traditionally published book with Berkeley, called The Siren of Sussex. Mimi herself is biracial. She is half Indian. And her male main character in The Siren of Sussex is also biracial, half Indian, British soldier father, and a woman from India as the mom, and they're living in England. And he is a tailor, so it's not like a duke. He's a tailor, which I love talking about the details of professions. And she desperately needs to find a wealthy husband because her family needs the money desperately. So they come to an agreement that if he designs and makes clothes for her that make her look beautiful, then he gets the reputation for being able to dress people beautifully and gets business. And then she will be able to find a wealthy husband, which is what she needs. Mm-hmm. But of course, they fall in love. And it's so interesting. It's beautifully written, gorgeously written, incredibly swoony, like romantic, and really considered and thoughtful about issues of race and class and gender in Victorian England, meticulously researched, and surprisingly hot for a book that is kisses only. It does not have like a graphic sex scene, but one thing I have said is that when he thinks about dressing her, he says that he makes the clothes to hold her in the way he wishes he could hold her. Which is like incredibly romantic, and I just think it's one of the best books I've read in months. It's so good. Mm-hmm.
Well, so, Caitlin just went out and bought it.
Caitlin, I know it's expensive. Like I know these trad pub ones I know they are expensive. It is so good. I bought it. Like I had an arc of it because she sent it to me for the blurb, but I went ahead and bought it because I'm like, I want to support this. This is great writing. Like it needs to the library. So yeah, good. Just get it at the library.
Thank you. Oh, look, I mean, yep, I love author recommendations. They just, I just love them. Anyways, thank you so much, Olivia, for being here. I feel like we've had this amazing conversation, so much more than I ever expected. I so appreciate you responding to my email because I was like,
no, I'm delighted to chat with you, and thank you for putting up with my rambling. I appreciate that.
Everything you said sort of made me want to either laugh or cry, just like in your book. So it was perfect. So I want to say thank you to everybody that's been here, and I hope that I will see you again soon in one of our many, many upcoming romance and other programs. So have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who said very nice things in the chat. in all the comments. I'm very appreciative. And I hope all is well in your corner of the world, wherever you are.